Rhythmic and mechanical, monitors in room 412 provided a steady heartbeat, the only sound within the sterilized cage holding Chicago's most dangerous man. For 6 months, Clara Jenkins was the sole keeper of his fading life. She bathed him, monitored his vitals, and in the dead of night, to keep herself from going mad in the deafening silence, she read to him. She thought she was comforting a ghost. She believed his mind was a million miles away in the dark. She was wrong. The night the assassins finally came to finish the job, the man who hadn't moved a muscle in half a year didn't just wake up. He grabbed her wrist, pulled her into the shadows, and whispered her name. The private wing of St. Jude's Medical Center didn't look like a hospital. It looked like the penthouse suite of a luxury hotel that happened to feature IV stands and oxygen regulators. There were no crying families in the hallways, no harried residents sprinting past with clipboards, and absolutely no unauthorized visitors. The floor was funded entirely by private donors, which was a polite, tax-deductible term for the Castiglione family. Clara Jenkins was 27, drowning in nursing school loans, and desperate enough to sign a non-disclosure agreement that looked more like a pact with the devil. For triple her usual salary, she was transferred to the 4th floor. Her sole patient was Nicholas Castiglione. The news reports called him a prominent logistics CEO. The whispers in the break room called him the ruthless head of the city's largest organized crime syndicate. 3 months prior, he had been gunned down outside a high-end steakhouse in River North. 5 bullets. 2 in the chest, 1 in the shoulder, and a grazing shot to the temple that had shattered his skull and plunged him into a deep, unyielding coma. When she first walked into room 412, Clara expected to feel intimidated. Instead, she just felt a profound, chilling emptiness. Nicholas Castiglione lay in the center of the vast, sterile room, tethered to life by a spiderweb of translucent tubes. He was a striking man, even in the pale, diminished state of near death. He had sharp, aristocratic features, thick, dark hair that she had to carefully wash every 3rd day, and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from marble. The Glasgow Coma Scale placed him at a stubborn 3. No eye-opening, no verbal response, no motor response. A living ghost. Outside his door stood Matteo Russo, a giant of a man in a tailored suit who never seemed to blink and rarely spoke. He was Nicholas's shadow, surviving the ambush that put his boss in the bed, and he treated the hospital corridor like a military checkpoint. For the first few weeks, Clara's routine was purely clinical. She checked his central line, managed his feeding tube, turned him every 2 hours to prevent bed sores, and charted his stagnant vitals. The silence of the room was oppressive. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilator and the steady, monotonous beep of the heart monitor. It was the sound of a man trapped in purgatory. To preserve her own sanity, she started bringing books. It began innocently enough. Clara would sit in the dim light of the bedside lamp during the grueling 3 a.m. slump of her night shift, reading quietly to herself. But the silence still pressed in on her. One rainy Tuesday in November, she looked at Nicholas's motionless face. His chest rose and fell with mechanical precision. She cleared her throat. "I don't know if you can hear me," she whispered, feeling slightly foolish. "The neurologists say you can't, but it's too quiet in here. So, you're going to listen to some Alexandre Dumas." She opened her dog-eared copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. She started at chapter 1. Her voice was tentative at first, but as the hours bled into days and the days into weeks, it became their ritual. She read about Edmond Dantes, a man betrayed by those closest to him, thrown into a dark, lightless cell, forgotten by the world, and left to rot. Sometimes, as she read the passages about Dantes' solitary confinement in the Château d'If, she would look up at Nicholas. The parallels were unnerving. Here was a powerful man, struck down by a betrayal he likely never saw coming, imprisoned within the dark cell of his own shattered mind. "Patience!" Clara read aloud one evening, the winter sleet tapping against the reinforced glass of the window. "Patience and time. That is the only way he would survive. She reached out with a warm, damp washcloth, gently wiping away a bead of sweat from his forehead. Her fingers brushed his temple, right near the pale pink scar of the bullet graze. For a fraction of a second, she thought she felt a microscopic flinch beneath her touch, a tightening of the jaw. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at his face for 5 agonizing minutes, watching for another sign. Nothing. The monitor kept its steady, uncaring rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. It was just a muscle spasm, she told herself. A random firing of damaged synapses. But as she picked up the book to continue, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that the oppressive emptiness of the room had shifted. It felt less like a tomb and more like a waiting room. By month 5, the atmosphere on the 4th floor began to curdle. The initial shock of Nicholas's incapacitation had worn off in the outside world, replaced by the dangerous, restless energy of a power vacuum. Clara didn't need to read the news to know things were getting bad. She could see it in the shifting dynamics outside room 412. Matteo Russo, the stoic bodyguard, looked increasingly exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes were bruised purple, and his suit hung a little looser on his massive frame. He was pacing more, his hand constantly hovering near the inside of his jacket. Then came the changes. Matteo wasn't always at the door anymore. New men rotated in men with colder eyes and less professional demeanors. They smoked in the stairwells despite hospital policy, and they looked at Nicholas not with reverence, but with a calculating, impatient hunger. The architect of this shift arrived on a freezing night in late January. His name was Leo Rossi. Rossi was Nicholas's underboss, a man who wore his ambition like a garish cologne. He walked into the VIP suite with the arrogance of a landlord surveying a property he was about to demolish. He was flanked by 2 of the new guards, and as he stood at the foot of Nicholas's bed, he didn't look sad. He looked inconvenienced. "Any change, nurse?" Rossi asked, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the rhythmic rise and fall of Nicholas's chest. "No, Mr. Rossi." Clara kept her voice neutral, organizing a tray of syringes to avoid his gaze. "Neurological function remains baseline. He is stable, but unresponsive." Rossi let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Stable, what a useless word. A rock is stable, sweetheart. Doesn't mean it's alive." He stepped closer, leaning over the bed rails. The scent of stale cigar smoke and peppermint rolled off him. "It's a tragedy," Rossi murmured, though his tone was mockingly light. "The boss, trapped like this, no dignity. A man like Nicholas. He wouldn't want to live as a vegetable. It's practically a disrespect to his legacy to keep him plugged into the wall like a busted television." A cold spike of dread drove itself into Clara's stomach. She gripped the edge of the medical cart. "The doctors say there is always a chance." "The doctors are paid to be optimistic," Rossi cut her off, finally turning his dead, pale blue eyes on her. "I'm a realist, and reality is, business is suffering. The family needs a head, not a ghost." He tapped his knuckles sharply against the metal bed frame. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the quiet room. "Keep up the good work, nurse, though I suspect your services won't be required much longer." He swept out of the room, leaving a toxic, heavy silence in his wake. Over the next 2 weeks, the tension became unbearable. Clara began to notice discrepancies. The medication logs had been viewed by an unauthorized user in the hospital's database. The security cameras in the outer hallway were suddenly malfunctioning for hours at a time. Her anxiety peaked one night when she went to the staff break room down the hall to grab a terrible cup of vending machine coffee. The door was slightly ajar. From inside, she heard the hushed, gravelly voice of one of Rossi's new guards. "End of the week," the voice was saying. "Leo is tired of waiting for nature to take its course. It looks weak, having the boss hooked up to tubes while the Colombians are encroaching on the South Side territory." "How?" another voice asked. "The nurse is always hovering. We pull her off the floor, say there's a problem with her credentials, then a minor adjustment to the IV drip. Potassium chloride. It stops the heart, looks like a massive cardiac event." Natural causes. Tragic, but inevitable. Clara backed away from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her hands shook so violently she spilled hot coffee over her scrubs, but she didn't feel the burn. She practically ran back to room 412, locking the heavy door behind her. She leaned against the wood, gasping for air. She looked at Nicholas. He looked so vulnerable, so completely at the mercy of the monsters circling his bed. She should go to the police, she thought. But what would she say? She heard a rumor in a break room. The Castiglione family owned half the precinct. She would be dead before her shift ended. Clara walked over to his bed, her legs trembling. She bypassed the clinical routine entirely. She leaned down, her lips inches from his ear. "Nicholas," she whispered, her voice cracking. She didn't care how crazy it was. She didn't care about the Glasgow scale. "Nicholas, you have to wake up. Do you hear me? Leo Rossi is taking over. They're going to kill you. They're going to stop your heart by the end of the week. Please, if you are in there, if you can hear me, you have to fight." She grabbed her copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. She didn't read it normally. She read it like a desperate prayer, pacing the room, reading the passages where Dantes realizes his enemy's plot, where the simmering rage gives him the strength to break free from his canvas shroud. She stopped at the foot of the bed, tears blurring her vision. "You have to be Dantes," she pleaded to the silent room. "Don't let them bury you alive." She stared at his face. The monitor beeped. Beep, beep, beep. Nothing. Clara buried her face in her hands and wept for a man she didn't know, a criminal who had somehow become the center of her isolated world. She wept because she knew, with absolute certainty, that she was going to watch him be murdered, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. It happened on a Thursday. A brutal winter storm had rolled in off Lake Michigan, battering the hospital windows with sheets of freezing rain and howling wind. The weather seemed to grant an excuse for the skeleton crew on the floor. Clara arrived for her 11 p.m. shift to find Matteo Russo gone. In his place was a man she'd never seen before, a thickly built man scrolling on his phone, who barely glanced up when she scanned her badge. Her stomach plummeted. The timeline the guards had discussed. End of the week. Inside room 412, the atmosphere was suffocating. Clara went through the motions of her shift in a state of hypervigilance. Every rattle of the window, every hiss of the HVAC system made her jump. She checked the lock on the door 3 times. She double-checked the seals on all of Nicholas's IV bags. She sat in the corner chair, the heavy hardcover of her book resting unread in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door handle. At 2:45 a.m., the power flickered. The hospital's backup generators kicked in almost instantly, but for 3 terrifying seconds, the room was plunged into pitch blackness. When the lights buzzed back to life, the door handle slowly began to turn. Clara stood up, her heart lodging itself in her throat. She backed away, pressing her shoulders against the cold wall near the closet. The door opened. It wasn't one of the guards. It was a man in a pristine white doctor's coat, wearing a surgical mask and a blue bouffant cap. He had a stethoscope draped around his neck, but the way he moved, silent, predatory, rolling on the balls of his feet, screamed that he had never taken the Hippocratic oath. He didn't even look at her. His eyes were locked on Nicholas. He pulled a syringe from the pocket of his coat. It was large, the fluid inside perfectly clear. Potassium chloride. The heart stopper. "Excuse me," Clara forced the words out, her voice shrill and trembling. "What are you doing? Dr. Evans hasn't ordered any new medications." The man ignored her, stepping up to the IV pole. He reached out to unscrew the port on Nicholas's central line. Instinct, blind and stupid, took over. She couldn't just stand there. Clara lunged forward, grabbing the man's forearm. "Stop! You can't do that!" With a low grunt of annoyance, the man backhanded her. The strike was brutal and casual. The back of his heavy knuckles caught her across the cheekbone, sending her crashing to the floor. Her head bounced against the linoleum, a burst of white-hot pain exploding behind her eyes. The room spun wildly. She tasted copper. She tried to push herself up, but her arms felt like lead. Through her blurred vision, she saw the assassin turn back to the bed. He uncapped the syringe with his teeth, spitting the plastic cap onto the floor. He gripped the IV port with his left hand, bringing the needle down with his right. "No," she gasped, reaching out weakly. The needle was an inch from the port. Then, the world shattered. It happened so fast her concussed brain could barely process it. A hand shot out from beneath the sterile white blankets. It wasn't a weak, atrophied fumble. It was a strike of terrifying, viper-like precision. Nicholas Castiglione's right hand clamped around the assassin's wrist, just below the syringe. The assassin froze, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock choking in his throat. He looked down at the bed, his eyes wide above his surgical mask. Nicholas's eyes were open. They weren't the vacant, wandering eyes of a man emerging from a coma. They were dark, violently lucid, and burning with a cold, calculated rage. The monitor next to the bed suddenly spiked, the slow, steady beep turning into a rapid, furious staccato. The assassin tried to pull his arm back, but Nicholas's grip was iron. Slowly, agonizingly, Nicholas twisted his wrist. A sickening crack echoed in the quiet room. The assassin screamed, dropping the syringe. It shattered on the floor. Nicholas didn't let go. With his other hand, moving with a stiff but brutal efficiency, he reached up, grabbed the assassin by the collar of his white coat, and yanked the man downward, smashing his face directly into the heavy metal guardrail of the bed. The man slumped to the floor, unconscious, bleeding heavily from a broken nose. The room fell into a horrifying, breathless silence, broken only by the screaming alarms of the heart monitor that Nicholas's sudden movement had tripped. Clara pushed herself up against the wall, clutching her bleeding cheek, staring in absolute terror and disbelief at the bed. Nicholas Castiglione slowly sat up. He ripped the nasal cannula from his face and tossed it aside. He looked down at the unconscious man on the floor, his expression completely devoid of emotion. Then, slowly, painfully, he turned his head and looked at her. His dark eyes locked onto hers, pinning her to the wall like a butterfly on corkboard. The silence stretched, tight as a wire. She was shaking so hard, her teeth rattled. He was awake. He had just brutally incapacitated a man, and she was the only witness. Nicholas opened his mouth. His voice was a raspy, gravelly whisper, destroyed by months of disuse and intubation tubes, but the words were clear as glass. "All human wisdom," Nicholas rasped, his eyes never leaving hers, "is contained in these two words." He paused, taking a slow, ragged breath, watching the shock wash over her face. Wait and hope. Clara stopped breathing. It was the final line of The Count of Monte Cristo. He hadn't just woken up. The realization hit her like a physical blow, colder than the winter wind outside. The slight flinch, the tightening jaw, the changing atmosphere in the room. He had been awake for weeks, maybe longer. Locked in his own body, he had laid there in silence, listening to his enemies plot his death, listening to Rossi's betrayal, and listening to her desperate, tearful warnings. He hadn't been trapped. He had been waiting. "Turn off that damn alarm, Clara," Nicholas whispered, his eyes hardening as he looked toward the door. "And get Matteo. We have work to do." Her trembling fingers slammed the mute button on the telemetry monitor. The sudden cessation of the blaring alarm left a ringing in her ears, making the silence of room 412 feel even heavier than before. Nicholas Castiglione was sitting up. It was a physical impossibility. The muscle atrophy alone should have kept him pinned to that mattress, but sheer, terrifying willpower was holding him upright. His chest heaved as he dragged in unassisted breaths, his pale skin slick with a cold sweat. He looked like a fallen king clawing his way out of a crypt. "Matteo," he repeated, his voice barely more than a grinding whisper. He coughed, a dry, rattling sound that made her chest ache. "Where is he?" I don't know," Clara stammered, pressing a hand to her throbbing cheek. When she pulled it away, Her fingertips were smeared with blood. He wasn't at the door when my shift started. There was a new man. One of Leo's. Nicholas's jaw clenched, the muscle ticking furiously beneath his pale skin. He looked down at the assassin bleeding on the floor, then back to her. They wouldn't kill Matteo on hospital grounds. Too much noise. Too much blood. They need my death to look clean. Natural. A tragic decline. His dark eyes bored into hers, stripping away every ounce of her professional detachment. They have him detained somewhere close. A holding room. A basement office. The sub-basement, she breathed, the realization dawning on her. The old pharmacy storage. It's been decommissioned for renovations. No cameras, no foot traffic. Nicholas gave a short, tight nod. He shifted his weight, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed, his hospital gown hitched up, revealing legs that had lost much of their muscle mass, but his grip on the metal bedrail was white-knuckled and unyielding. "Help me up," he commanded. It wasn't a request. Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second. Every protocol, every nursing instinct screamed at her to force him back down, to call a code, to get a doctor. But the man on the floor, with the shattered wrist and the syringe of potassium chloride, was all the proof she needed that calling the doctors would be a death sentence. She stepped forward, sliding her arm around his waist, letting him drape his heavy arm over her shoulders. He was freezing cold, his skin like marble, but beneath the surface, she could feel a terrifying, coiled tension. As he put weight on his legs, he let out a sharp hiss of pain, his knees buckling. She braced herself, taking the brunt of his weight, her boots slipping slightly on the linoleum. "I've got you," she whispered fiercely, surprised by the steady conviction in her own voice. "I've got you, Nicholas." He turned his head. His face was mere inches from hers. For the first time, she wasn't looking at a sleeping patient. She was looking into the eyes of the apex predator of Chicago. There was a dangerous magnetism in his gaze, a dark gravity that threatened to pull her under. He lifted his free hand, his knuckles brushing against her bruised, bleeding cheekbone. His touch was shockingly gentle compared to the violence she had just witnessed. "He'll pay for this," Nicholas murmured, his thumb tracing the edge of the swelling. "But right now, Clara, I need you to be braver than you've ever been in your life. I need you to go down to that sub-basement." Her stomach performed a sickening flip. "Alone? I cannot walk those halls," he said, the frustration bleeding through his raspy tone. "If Leo's men see me, they will finish the job with bullets. You wear the scrubs. You belong here. Find Matteo. Tell him. Tell him the Count is awake." Clara swallowed hard, tasting her own fear. She looked at the door, then back at him. She had spent 6 months keeping this man alive. She wasn't going to let him die tonight. "There's a wheelchair in the closet," she said, moving quickly. She dragged it out, locking the wheels, and helped him pivot into the vinyl seat. She tossed a thick wool blanket over his lap to hide his trembling legs. "If anyone comes in here, you pretend you're still under. Understand?" A dark, dangerous smile curved his lips. "I've had 6 months of practice, Clara. Go." Clara slipped out of room 412, stepping into the deserted, dimly lit hallway. The storm outside raged on, rattling the window panes and masking the sound of her hurried footsteps. The journey to the service elevator felt like a slow march to the gallows. Every shadow looked like a man with a gun. She hit the button for the sub-basement. The descent was agonizingly slow. When the doors pinged open, she stepped into a maze of concrete walls and flickering fluorescent lights. The air smelled of dust and old antiseptic. She crept down the corridor, listening intently. Above the hum of the hospital's generators, she heard it a muffled, rhythmic thumping. It was coming from the heavy steel door of the decommissioned pharmacy. She pressed her ear against the cold metal. "Matteo?" she whispered. The thumping stopped. A muffled, furious voice filtered through the steel. "Who is that? Clara?" Relief washed over her so intensely her knees nearly gave out. Yes, hold on. She looked at the electronic keypad. The red light was glaring. It's locked, Mateo. Do you know the code? It's a standard maintenance lock, he yelled through the door. Try 9991. She punched in the numbers. A harsh buzz. Red light. It didn't work, she called back. Try the override. 0451. She typed frantically. The light flashed green, and the heavy bolt clicked back. She pulled the handle, and the door swung open. Matteo Russo was tied to a structural pipe with heavy-duty zip ties, his face battered, his suit jacket torn. The moment he saw her, his eyes widened in panic. Clara, you shouldn't be down here. You have to run. Leo ordered the hit on the boss tonight. There's an assassin on the floor. I know, she interrupted, dropping to her knees and pulling a pair of trauma shears from her scrub pocket. She began sawing frantically at the thick plastic binding his wrists. He came into the room. Matteo went completely still. The color drained from his face. Is Nicholas? He's awake, she said, the thick zip tie finally snapping open. Matteo stared at her as if she had just spoken in tongues. What did you say? He stopped the assassin. He broke his wrist. He told me to come get you. She looked Matteo dead in the eye. He said to tell you the Count is awake. A terrifying transformation came over Matteo. The panic vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. He stood up, rolling his broad shoulders, a low, menacing chuckle rumbling in his chest. Leo Rossi is a dead man walking. Matteo didn't need to be told twice. He drew a suppressed handgun from a hidden holster at his ankle. One, the men who ambushed him, had somehow missed, and they moved. They took the service stairs back to the 4th floor, moving like ghosts in the stairwell. When they reached the hallway outside 412, Leo's guard was still there, sitting in a chair, scrolling on his phone. He never even heard Matteo come up behind him. With a swift, brutal strike, the butt of the gun connected with the back of the guard's skull. The man slumped to the floor without a sound. Matteo dragged him into an empty supply closet. They pushed open the door to room 412. Nicholas was right where Clara had left him, sitting in the wheelchair in the dim shadows of the corner. The assassin was still unconscious, bound tightly with medical gauze, a rag stuffed in his mouth. Boss, Matteo breathed, dropping to one knee beside the wheelchair. It was a gesture of absolute, unfeigned loyalty. You're back. I never left, Matteo, Nicholas rasped, his hand gripping his bodyguard's shoulder. But my patience has expired. The trap was set with the meticulous precision of a chess master. Nicholas refused to get back into the bed. Instead, they staged the scene. They pulled the sterile sheets up over pillows, forming the shape of a body. They attached the heart monitor leads to the unconscious assassin, bound and gagged on the floor under the bed, ensuring a steady, rhythmic beep would fill the room. Nicholas sat in the wheelchair, pushed into the deepest shadows of the room, behind the heavy privacy curtain near the closet. Matteo stood flat against the wall behind the door, completely out of sight. Clara sat in her usual chair by the window, the book open in her lap, her heart beating so hard she was certain the entire room could hear it. He will come to confirm the kill, Nicholas had whispered in the dark just moments before. Leo is too vain to trust another man's word. He needs to see my corpse. They waited. The storm outside raged, a chaotic symphony that perfectly masked the tension inside. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The silence was agonizing. Finally, the handle turned. The door pushed open slowly. Leo Rossi stepped into room 412. He was wearing a dark, expensive cashmere overcoat, snow dusting the shoulders. He looked around, his eyes sweeping over Clara, dismissing her instantly, before locking onto the bed. He didn't notice the missing assassin. He only saw the unmoving lump under the blankets and heard the steady beep of the monitor. Rossi smirked. It was a cold, ugly expression of triumph. He walked slowly toward the foot of the bed, pulling off his leather gloves. It's done then, Rossi said, his voice dripping with false melancholy. He looked over at Clara. I see you survived the night, nurse. I suppose Arthur was clean about it. Clara gripped the edges of her book, staring at him, saying nothing. Don't look at me like that, Rossi sighed, leaning against the metal footboard. It's the natural order of things. The weak are culled so the strong can thrive. Nicholas was a titan once, but keeping him here? Like a museum exhibit? It was pathetic. I did him a favor. Did you, Leo? The voice drifted out from the shadows behind the privacy curtain. It was raspy, broken, and completely devoid of warmth. Rossi froze. The color instantly vanished from his face. He stared at the curtain, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He reached for his coat pocket, but before his fingers could even brush the fabric, the heavy wooden door behind him slammed shut, and the distinctive click of a gun's safety echoing in the room. Hands where I can see them, Leo, Matteo commanded from the doorway, his weapon leveled directly at Rossi's head. Rossi slowly raised his hands, his eyes wide with a terror that bordered on madness. Matteo, you're supposed to be dead? Matteo supplied helpfully. You should hire better men. The privacy curtain slowly drew back. Clara pushed Nicholas forward in the wheelchair. The dim light of the bedside lamp caught the sharp, hollow angles of his face, making him look less like a man and more like an avenging spirit. Rossi stumbled backward, hitting the side of the bed. Nicholas, boss, it's a miracle. The lie was so frantic, so desperate, it was almost pitiful. A miracle, Nicholas repeated softly. He wheeled himself closer. No, Leo, a miracle implies divine intervention. This was just patience, the kind you learn when you are locked in the dark. Nicholas stopped the chair a few feet from his underboss. The air in the room was electric, heavy with the promise of violence. I heard everything, Leo, Nicholas said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the terrifying weight of absolute authority. For 2 months, I have been awake in that bed. I heard you complain about the Colombian territory. I heard you ordering the rerouting of the dock shipments. And I heard you, standing exactly where you are now, talking about how my legacy was an inconvenience. Rossi was visibly shaking now. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill in the room. Nicholas, I swear to God, they were pressuring me, the captains. They thought you were gone. I had to project strength. You projected ambition. Nicholas cut him off. And treason. Nicholas slowly lifted his right hand, the same hand that had broken an assassin's wrist an hour ago, and pointed a single finger at the door. Take him, Matteo. Take him to the warehouse on the river. I want all the captains there by sunrise. They need to see what happens when you try to bury a man who is still breathing. Nicholas, please! Rossi begged, his arrogant facade completely shattered. He lunged forward, but Matteo grabbed him by the collar of his expensive coat, throwing him forcefully against the wall and jamming the barrel of the gun under his chin. Not another word, Leo, Matteo snarled. He looked at Nicholas. Consider it done, boss. Matteo hauled the sobbing, terrified Rossi out of the room. The door clicked shut behind them. Suddenly, the room was empty again. Just Clara and the man in the wheelchair. The adrenaline that had been keeping her upright suddenly evaporated. Her knees gave way, and she sank into the chair by the window, burying her face in her hands. A sob tore its way up her throat. The sheer terror of the night, the violence, the unbelievable reality that the man she had been reading to for half a year was currently plotting a Mafia execution. It was all too much. She felt a warm pressure on her knee. She looked up. Nicholas had wheeled himself over to her. He was exhausted, his face drawn and pale, the physical exertion clearly taking a massive toll on his recovering body. But his eyes were incredibly soft as he looked at her. He reached out, taking her trembling hand in his. His grip was warm and surprisingly steady. I am sorry, Clara, he said quietly. I am sorry I brought my darkness into your light. You didn't bring it, she whispered, wiping a tear from her good cheek. It found you here. I didn't know. You knew enough to warn me, he said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. You knew enough to stay when you could have run. You fought for a ghost. You kept me tethered to the world when I was drifting in the dark. I heard your voice. Every single night. The Count of Monte Cristo. You gave me the anchor I needed to fight my way back to the surface. He leaned forward slightly, the distance between them vanishing. The smell of antiseptic was overpowered by the sudden, intense scent of him clean, masculine, and alive. Tomorrow, Matteo will bring you a briefcase, Nicholas said, his voice turning deadly serious. It contains $2 million in untraceable cash and a new passport. You can leave Chicago. You can pay off your debts, go anywhere in the world, and you will never see me or my world again. You have earned your freedom. Clara stared at him, her heart hammering a new, frantic rhythm against her ribs. It was an out, a perfect, clean escape. And if I don't want the briefcase? She asked, her voice barely a breath. Nicholas's eyes darkened, a flash of possessive heat flaring in the depths of his gaze. He slowly brought her hand to his lips, pressing a warm, lingering kiss against her palm. A shiver raced down her spine. If you stay, he murmured against her skin, his eyes locking onto hers. You stay with me, in my world, by my side. I will give you everything, Clara. I will burn down anyone who tries to touch you. But there will be no walking away. The storm outside howled, throwing rain against the glass. But inside, room 412, the world had narrowed down to the space between them. She looked at the man who had returned from the dead, the man whose pulse she had monitored, whose mind she had unknowingly saved. She thought about the boring, safe life she had before she walked onto the 4th floor. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the pale scar on his temple. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. I never did get to finish the book, she whispered. Nicholas opened his eyes, a slow, breathtaking smile transforming his face. He pulled her gently from the chair, drawing her down until she was kneeling in front of him, his arms wrapping tightly around her waist, anchoring her to him in the dark. Then we have all the time in the world, he promised. If this story had your heart pounding and your pulse racing, you are not going to want to miss what we have coming next. The world of underground empires, dangerous secrets, and forbidden romance is just getting started on this channel. Did Clara make the right choice staying with Nicholas, or should she have taken the money and run? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you loved this deep dive into the shadows of Room 412, hit that like button to show your support. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love a dark, twisting romance, and absolutely smash that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss out when a new, thrilling story drops. Until next time, stay safe and remember, always watch the shadows.